In this video, we're going to talk about how to move models that you create from Maya to Unreal and the proper pipelines that are used normally in different industries, as well as all the various options you have to make your life easier and to solve problems that you may run into. You're going to need a brand new Maya scene. And while your Maya may look a little bit different than mine, that's okay. We're going to go over how I set up this grid and everything. And you're going to need probably a blank Unreal project. I created a third-person brand new project. That's up to you if you want to use a project you're currently working on. Just keep in mind it might get a little bit messy. So let's start by simply creating a cube. Now I'm just going to simply export it. So I'm going to left-click and select the cube. I'm going to go to File, Export Selection. Under the file type, I'm going to choose FBX Export. And then I need to set some options on those export settings. So under the options, under include options, we have file type specific options, and then include again, and then geometry. And underneath that, there's a list of options for what you'd usually want for geometry or meshes. The two that you usually always want on are smoothing groups and tangents and binormals. Now, in some cases, you may want some of these others, but we're going to start simple. And now we're going to choose where we want to export to. So I'm going to go to Desktop, and I have a folder that I created called Unreal Test _source. Now, normally I wouldn't call this Unreal Test. I would call this whatever project I'm working on. Maybe it's an environment, maybe it's a game, whatever. But these are the source files for that project. So the files that I'm creating in Maya, in Substance Painter, etc. I'm going to export in here. And I'm going to call this SM_cube. Export selection. And then I'm going to go into Unreal and I'm going to open up the content drawer and I'll go to the main content folder. And before I start messing up and making this all dirty, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to title this Import Testing. So in here is just what we're going to do for the purpose of this tutorial, but obviously you can import your assets to wherever you want. I'm going to right click on the blank area. I'm going to hit import to game. You could also hit import on this button right here and do that. And then what I'm going to do is go to Desktop, Unreal Test Source, and there's our cube FBX. We're going to select that. And the default FBX importer options come up. I'm going to reset these to default so you know that I have what you probably have. I would recommend you click reset to default as well. And all we're going to do is we're just going to hit import. So you can see immediately what it's done is it's brought in our static mesh. It's got this very little tiny icon of it, and we'll talk about that in a second. And it auto-created a material. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But the thing that you need to know is that if you import a single FBX, by default, it titles the mesh that you bring in, whatever the FBX name is. So it called it SM Cube because that was the name of our FBX file. This material's name was actually created by the material name in Maya. So if I go to Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, you can actually see that the material that we were using is standard surface 1. And so in Unreal, it called it standard surface 1. If I drag this into the viewport, it's there. It may look invisible, but it's there. So let's hit F. That is absurdly tiny. That is absurdly tiny. So I'm holding on Alt, left click, and dragging to orbit around it, but that is clearly not what we would usually want to bring in. But just so you understand, what it did is exactly what we told it to do. This is technically 1 Unreal unit or 1 centimeter. What you normally see when you create a cube is 1 meter or 100 centimeters. Now, if you ever want to see that, you can go to the other viewports. And what we're going to do is hit Shift F when we're selected on this cube so that it zooms in and focuses on all of the viewports. And then in Unreal, if you ever want to measure something, so let's say I zoom out some and I move over to this cube. If I hold on the middle mouse button and drag, you can see it's telling me the size of the object. So that's 100 Unreal units. This object is so tiny, it's actually even hard to find. So I'm going to select it, hit Shift F again, that it would be hard to measure unless we changed the grid size to 1. And then if we change the grid size to 1, you can see that is 1 unit, and that pretty much matches exactly. It would be hard to get it to that spot because we have grid snapping on. And so you can already see this can get pretty complex when we're talking about scale and proportions and things like that. But we're going to cover all of that. I just wanted you to see what happens if you basically export this out without thinking about anything else. So now let's go back into Maya and let's talk about all of these options, how we can clean them up and how we can fix them. So let's start by covering organization and file naming. So it's really important that you keep your scenes clean, especially if you're going to be working with other people or you're going to take a break on it. It's just good etiquette. You're going to notice later when we use a different type of exporter that's honestly a lot easier and automates a lot of the process. You need these things named well for it to work properly. So in the Maya outliner, and if you don't have it open, it's this button right here. I'm going to double left click it to rename it, and I am going to call it SM_cube. Now we have it named the way we would want in here, as well as we assume this is the name that is going to be used in Unreal. Now, before we go any further, we should talk about history and transforms within Maya. Most modeling packages, and in fact, most packages that we use, do save some sort of history of the object. Maya has kind of two ways of doing that. The first is this input stack, which is history. If you subdivide an object, or if you add edge loops, or if you do any sort of manipulation to it, it starts adding history. Now you can delete that history, and normally you should. And the reason for that is most other software packages do not need that data to function. And in fact, transferring all of that data to other software packages usually confuses them. It's extremely common that in any industry, you commonly delete your history before exporting. The second similar aspect to that is transforms. Maya has a unique way of handling transforms, which is translate, rotate, scale. And the way it does that is by allowing you to set a default translate, rotation, and scale location within world space that at any time you can zero back out to. Other modeling packages don't necessarily have this, but Maya does. So let's look at an example of that. If I move this cube over here, we can see that it says translate on Z is, let's type in 10, it's 10. I could also scale up one of the axes by 10. And so you can see it says 10, 10, and I'll even rotate on the Z axes. We'll do 45 degrees, right? So we have specialized data within the transforms. However, in Maya, I can go to modify freeze transformations and it zeroes everything out and sets everything to the defaults. This is designed so that later you can manipulate things or animate things. And then if you wanted to say, wait, I want it back at what I considered my default location, you can zero it back out and it will go there. So the other good thing about this is it allows us to clean this up. And that way, when we export to other software packages, they don't see any extra data within the transforms. So we normally do want to delete history and freeze transforms. Now, you're going to do this so unbelievably often that I highly recommend you set hotkeys instead of constantly going to edit, delete by type history, and modify freeze transformations. I'm going to show you how to set those up now. So we're going to go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Hotkey Editor. Now this is going to open up, and in here we can set hotkeys for pretty much any functionality within Maya. Under Edit Hotkeys for, switch this to Menu Items because it is a menu item. And we're going to go to Edit, Delete by Type. And what we're going to choose is Non-Deformer History because, to be honest, that's usually what we're going to want. Now, I'm going to hold on Control and Shift and Alt, all three of them. And you can see if I do that, nothing on the right side is set. So if I hit D for Delete History, then I have that set to Control Alt Shift D. Now, anytime I hit that, it will delete that history. So let me hit Save. And we're also going to scroll up, minimize edit, and go to Modify. And under Freeze Transformations, we will set a hotkey for Control Alt Shift F. Save that, and now we can close it. So now anytime we're getting prepared to export, we can hit Control Alt Shift D, Control Alt Shift F, and we'll instantly have it ready for exporting. So the next topic we're going to cover is scale and size. In order to do that, we're going to delete this cube because we probably messed with it quite a bit. And we're going to create a new one and immediately call it SM_cube. Remember, just double left click on it in the outliner to do that. You can also always name it right here, assuming that you have the channel box open. Now, scale and size are very, very different things. The size of an object is generally measured in centimeters or meters or feet or inches, some sort of measurement system. Scale is a multiplier of that. If I have an object that is 1 foot, or let's say 2 feet, and then I say it's 3 scale, that is a 6-foot object because it was 2 feet times 3, which is 6. 2 times 3 is 6. So they're completely different things. Most software packages put scale here. And in fact, it's pretty common that in 3D, we don't really think that much about real-world measurements unless we're doing architectural visualization, we're trying to match things exactly, or in modern times, definitely if we're doing something like 3D printing. However, it is important for us to consider because when you're exporting out to packages, you have to understand that within even your own package, scale is relative. Again, we've seen that if I freeze transformations, these set back to 1. So even if I make this huge and it says 92, once I freeze transformations, it will say 1. Its size is different, but its scale is relative. So what we want to do is see if we can get this cube to match what the cube in Unreal is. So let's go ahead and grab this and set it to 100, 100, 100. Now, the reason this will work is because the default cube in Maya is also 1 centimeter. So if the default cube in Unreal is 100 centimeters and the default cube in Maya is 1 centimeter, then if I scale it by 100, it is now 100 centimeters, and it should be the same size. Now remember, what we're going to want to do is freeze transformations and delete history. So I'm going to use my hotkeys, Control Alt Shift D, and you can see the history cleared out, and then I'll hit Control Alt Shift F, and you can see the transforms are now frozen. So I'm going to go ahead and export this. I'm going to go to File, Export Selection. Remember, I have it selected, and I'm going to export directly over SM Cube. Want to replace it? Yes. I'll open up Unreal. I'm going to go back to the 3D viewport. And what I can do is right-click on the cube and hit Re-import. Now, if Re-import doesn't ever work there's various different reasons that could happen, simply import and have the same name and it will override it. But you can already see This pretty much matches that cube directly. So let's change this to something like 10. And there we go. That matches perfectly. So that's pretty much what we want. And having this cube is a very good reference for scale if you're starting out as a beginner and you haven't built a library, or I should say size. The reason for that is 1 meter is a good starting reference for a character, because a character, even in Unreal, is very often 1.8 meters roundabout. And that's because that's about 6 feet tall. So if I duplicate this cube and put it on top of the other one, that's pretty close to how tall a character would be. It's not perfect, but if we wanted it perfect, we could even create a cube and we could set it to 100. And then in Maya, Y is up, so 180 and 100. And now that is about 1.8 meters. I mean, it is literally mathematically 1.8 meters. So that would be very, very close to a character's height. Knowing size and scale is vitally important. And if you're ever working in a pipeline, especially with other people, and you get an asset and you notice it's off, you need to tell someone, you need to have it fixed, because if it moves down the pipeline wrong, you're just going to make other people have to do a lot more work when it eventually does get caught and it needs to be fixed. Now, the last thing I want to mention about scale and size is that when you're working within meters and proper real world distances and sizes, you're going to notice that the default Maya viewport and grid do not handle that well. In fact, it's very likely the grid in your scene is inside of this cube. So the way that you can fix that and set up Maya to handle these scales and sizes correctly is the grid icon in the top viewport panel, right click on it and go to grid options. And this window will appear. Now yours is going to say something like this, 1255. And you can see if I hit apply, my grid goes away because it's inside this cube. But the common way you're probably going to want to set it up is set this to something like 10,000. Set grid lines every 100 units, so that would be 1 meter, and subdivisions every 10 units, so every 10 centimeters. Now, the other thing is the default colors look like this, and you can see if I hit apply, you can't really see the grid lines very well. You can see the subdivision lines, but if I take the grid lines and I move the color right here, just over to the right one and hit apply, now you can see them very well. And this will help you with relative measurements. And so I highly recommend this is how you set up your grid when working in these size values. And the other thing that you're going to run into is that as you get objects larger and larger or smaller and smaller, you're going to start having issues like this where they disappear or they get really finicky in terms of the edges start flickering a whole lot. What's happening is your camera's view plane is not set up for these distances. And I know that might sound weird if you haven't ever dealt with camera view planes, but in 3D, a lot of stuff is done to help with rasterization, rendering, and performance. And camera view planes is one of those features. Now, to change that in Maya, you have to go to View in the viewport settings, and then go to Camera Attribute Editor. I'll left click on that, and it almost always is bugged out. What it does is it opens up the attribute editor, but it doesn't actually go to the camera attribute. So very often you have to do it a second time, and then it opens up. It's been a bug for 10 years. In the camera attributes editor, yours is probably going to be set a little different than mine, maybe not. But what you usually want at these scales is probably a near clip plane of 1 and a far clip plane. Usually the best thing to do is just add 2 zeros to it. If you make it too far, like too big on either of these, you'll start getting issues in another direction. But you can see now I can see the entire grid. I can still zoom in fine, and everything will render well. Remember this, because if you import something really big like a house, or you're building out a house, you're going to notice rendering issues in the viewport if you do not change this. Now that we have all of that set up, let's go ahead and move on to some other options that are important when exporting meshes out to Unreal. So another really important option to know about is the pivot. Pivots are incredibly important in 3D. Depending on where you put it, it can mean the difference between a ton of work or very little work. For example, spinning a tire, you want the pivot in the center of the tire. Having a door that you can easily open and close. So for example, something like, well, let's create a new cube and mess with that. Make it much bigger. Actually, just come to the channel box and we will type 100 on the z-axis, 200 on the y-axis, and 20 on the x-axis. And we'll pretend this is a door. So let's say I want to move the pivot down here so that when I rotate it, it opens and closes really well. If I hit insert, I can toggle the pivot to be moved. You can also hold on D in Maya, whatever you prefer. I personally prefer the insert method. So I'm going to hit insert. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold on V to snap to vertices and grab the blue manipulator and make sure that I pull it to this side so it snaps to this side. And then still while holding on V, I'll grab the green manipulator and pull it down. Now, if your colors are different because of the orientation of your camera, that is okay. You're just trying to get the pivot to this location on the door. So now that I have it there, you can see if I rotate, I can very easily open and close the door. Pivots can matter a lot, but the problem is, by default, Unreal is not going to read the pivot of your object. So let me show you an example of what it actually does. I'm going to take this cube and I'm going to move it away from the center of the grid. So this is the center of the grid. This is my cube, and it's over here. Remember that my pivot in Maya is in the center of the cube. So let's go ahead and Control-Alt-Shift-D and F to delete history and freeze transformations. Then we're going to go to File, Export Selection, and we're going to choose SM Cube, export it, go into Unreal, open up the content, right-click on the cube, and hit Re-Import. Now you see it moved in the scene because we just changed its pivot. You see how the pivot is over here, even though in Maya it's in the center? That's because by default, the way Unreal works is it reads the center of the world space as the pivot, no matter what. Now, if you're used to Unity or other types of game engines, this may not be something that you have ever had to deal with. There are reasons for this. Let me explain. In a production setting, in almost every case, you're going to be asked to model one thing, and so you're going to do that in your singular Maya scene. Like today you're going to do this chair, or this week you're going to do this chair, or whatever it is. But that's it. Other people are going to do other assets. So you don't often have hundreds of assets in your scene. And when you do it that way, it kind of makes sense to have it put to the center of the grid wherever you want the pivot to be. So if I wanted the pivot there, I would usually center it out in world space and freeze transformation so that it's all clean if the next person opens it. Now, if you're in a use case where you have a lot of assets in the scene, there are ways to deal with that. But the most common use case for that, to be honest, is architectural visualization, or maybe you're a solo developer. Architectural visualization, what it normally is they would have the entire scene built out because it was already done in something like CAD software, and they're handing it to you and want you to render it in Unreal. So the common thing then is you're exporting out all these different pieces and you want to rebuild the scene in Unreal. Well, the great news is that if this object is over here, and let's say I have another one over here and another one over here, they're all going to export out where their pivot is here. Meaning then when I pull them into Unreal, I can set them all to 0, 0, 0, and it will rebuild this exact structure for me. Now, this is not something that you normally want to do for games where you're worried about optimization, massive reuse, constant modifying, things like that. Usually, you're going to want it to be centered on the grid and cleared out, and you're not going to want to rebuild, quote unquote, the scene in Unreal. You're sending out objects so that you can just build scenes in Unreal, all sorts of different scenes and levels. All that being said, there is a tool that makes this easier for us. At a core fundamental level, we simply need to make sure our pivot is where we want it. So let's say I want it in the bottom corner of this cube. I just hit Insert, held on V, and snapped to this location. I'll hit Insert to turn that off, and then I'll hold on X to snap it to the grid here. So fundamentally, I just want to get the pivot where I want and set it to the center of the grid. But if I had a bunch of objects in the scene and I want them in different locations and I don't want to stack them all in the center of the grid, that is okay. What I can do is freeze transformations and delete history. And I can go to File, Game Exporter. Now, the game exporter in Maya is actually pretty nice. By default, it's going to export out as FBXs, and there's a lot of different things we can do with this to modify settings. One of the things we want to do right away is drop down Export All and choose Export Selection. We don't want to export other things in the scene that we didn't want to, right? We always want to export what we have selected. Under the geometry setting, you can see it's the settings that you would have for FBXs, and they already have smoothing groups and tangents and binormals. The other settings are totally fine. Drop down actual settings, and what you can do is click Move to Origin. Now, if you do that, it will move the object to the origin for you when it exports, and then you don't have to ever deal with it. It won't actually move it in here. It's going to move it behind the scenes so you don't see it move here, and it will stay where you want it in your Maya scene. But then you're going to choose your path. So under my desktop, Unreal Source, choose, and enter a file name. So I will call this sm_cube and hit export. Now it asks me, do you want to overwrite the one that's already there? I'll hit yes. And what we should see in Unreal now is the pivot being here, even though this is not at the center of the grid. So let's go back to Unreal. We're going to re-import this cube. And there we go. So the pivot is in that corner. So now what we're going to do is that. And you might say, hey, that's on the bottom. Believe it or not, we've kind of been working upside down. So if you see right here, it says we're on the bottom. This is the top of the grid. So that was a mistake on my part, but it's actually kind of good to see something like that so you understand what's going on. If I do want the pivot down at the bottom, what I consider the bottom of this cube, I can move it down here. And again, it doesn't even have to be at the center of the grid. Control-Alt-Shift-D, Control-Alt-Shift-F. I already have it selected. I'll hit export. Yes. Go back into Unreal. Re-import. And there we go. Now, two last things before we end this. I want you to understand that this pivot has been moving around a lot when we've been exporting. So it's really important in your production pipelines to get your pivots correct early. Otherwise, you're going to constantly have things moving around in your scene. And the second thing is, as we go through the rest of this video, we're going to go through more options about this window. So I want you to keep in mind that if you do multiple objects at once, there are settings in this that you need to change for it to react well in Unreal, but we will cover that at the end of the video. So the next thing we need to talk about is surface normals. If you already know what surface normals are, you can skip to the next section where I'm going to talk about how to simply make sure that they're exporting. But if you've never heard of normals before or you need a refresh, I suggest you watch this section. So I'm going to go ahead and create a plane, and I'm going to set it to 100, 100, 100. I'm going to very quickly hit Control-Alt-Shift-D and F. I'm going to rename this plane to SM_plane, and I'm going to export this out. So I'm going to go to File, Game Exporter, leave all the settings, but I'm going to change this to SM_plane, export it. It's successful. And I'm going to go into Unreal, right-click, import a brand new asset, and pull in the plane. Import it with the default settings, and there we go. Now, this may look correct, and it is correct, but what you're going to notice really quickly is if you look below it, it disappears. Now, the reason I'm showing this is because that happens because of surface normals. By default, all 3D geometry you've ever created has one faced siding. It's actually only one side, and most modeling packages do a lot of rendering to help you see the other side. They do a lot of special techniques to help you see the other side. And that's good when you're modeling, but when you're trying to optimize things to run well, you don't want any extra special techniques that are going to change that or add onto rendering times. Now, if you don't believe me that that is true in something like Maya, if you go to lighting, yours is probably set to two-sided lighting, and you can see both sides look the same. But if I turn off two-sided lighting, one side turns black. That is the side where the normals are not existing. This side has normals, and they're facing up and away from this side. In fact, we can preview them, and we will. Let's go to Display, Polygons, and we're going to turn on Face Normals. Now you'll see these little itty-bitty lines, so we're going to go to Display, Polygons, Normal Sizes, and we're going to set this to 2 so that we can see them a little bit better. And now you can see they're facing up and away from this dark side. That is a surface normal. The other thing that I can do is I can go to Shading, Backface Culling, and you'll see that now it renders just like Unreal. There is no side because that is a back face. It is the back of this face, and that is what normals are doing at a basic level. It is telling light to bounce off this and react in a certain way and smooth out in a certain way. Is an easy way of thinking of it. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off backface culling, but I like leaving two-sided lighting off so that I know which side is the back faces. Now, this plane is a good way of showing that, but it doesn't really showcase the best use cases for why we use normals or what are sometimes called smoothing groups. So when you're talking about face normals, they're facing away from their faces, and they're choosing how the light will react to the surface and bend and how the surface renders and appears. This is a simple way of thinking of it. Now, if you group a bunch of those together and they're all reacting a different way or in a same way, that's what you call smoothing groups. You have different groups that react in the same way, but not every group reacts the same to every other group. If I go to Mesh Display and hit Harden Edge, you will see what happens when you harden normals. This did not change the amount of polys, but this now looks like a disco ball. Now, if I go back and go to Mesh Display, Soften Edge, you can see it looks like it was before. Again, same amount of polygons. It's just now it's displaying differently because of the face normals. Now, when we talk about smoothing groups, which if you remember, they were in the export options, it's stuff that we wanted. What they're referencing is the fact that I can grab specific faces and go to Mesh Display, Harden, or Soften, and I can set different parts of the model to react different ways. Now, the further you get into game asset development or real-time asset development, you get into baking, you're going to start realizing this stuff matters a ton. But at a beginner's level, this is incredibly important because this data does transfer into game engines. And it's one of the best ways to stay optimized while still making things appear smooth or soft. So if you're ever modeling something, let's say a cylinder, and it looks really rough and jaggedy and faceted, then you probably want to go to Mesh Display, Soften Edge, because again, this does transfer. Now, to show that, let's go ahead and grab these top faces again, and we'll go to Mesh Display, Harden Edge. We'll reselect this in object mode, and I'm going to delete all this history, Control-Alt-Shift-D, freeze the transformations, Control-Alt-Shift-F, and I'm going to rename this to SM_sphere. It would help if I spelt it correctly. Now I'm going to go to File, Game Exporter, and I'm going to rename this to Sphere. And remember, I have smoothing groups on, which is what we just messed with. So when I export and go into Unreal and import this sphere, import, we can see that if we drag it in the scene, the top looks faceted and the bottom looks smooth because it transferred those smoothing groups. So this is really important to remember. If you're seeing this on your model and you do not want it, you need to remember that you got to modify these things. Now the next thing to talk about is smoothing. There are some cases where you may want your model to export out where it's much smoother. So a very common example of this is if I grab this cube and I hit 3 in Maya, what it does is it previews it in an isoline display where it looks like it's been smoothed with Mesh Smooth. Mesh Smooth is destructive, meaning I can't just hit 1 and go back. It saves it into the history. You don't necessarily want to do that to your models. That's fully understandable. And so very often you want to hit the 3 key just to see what it would look like when it is smooth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this cube. And I'm going to call this cube smooth. And I'm going to move it away from that cube. Now I'm going to hit the 3 key because that's what I want it to look like. Now the good news is, as of Maya 2024, as long as you hit the 3 key and go ahead and delete history and freeze transforms, you go to File, Game Exporter. The Game Exporter will handle this for you, which is actually a little weird because you normally would have to click Smooth Mesh. But as long as you have hit the 3 key, it will work. So I'm going to export it as SM_cube smooth, and I'm going to hit export. It's going to ask me if I want to replace it because I've done some tests. For you, it'll be new. But if you go into Unreal and right click and import, choose cube smooth, import, there it is. It is a smoothed version. It is a sphere, even though technically in Maya, if I hit the 1 key, it's a cube. Now, I feel it's important to note that mostly in games, you do not want to smooth your objects. You actually want to make sure that the object that you're exporting out is the exact amount of polys, the exact silhouette as in your modeling package. But this feature does exist. What if you were doing an art style similar to Pixar's? You obviously would want things much smoother and much higher poly. So this is totally understandable if you need this functionality. Now let's talk about UVs. And I think it's a good point that if you haven't already, make sure that you save your Maya scene and that you save your Unreal project. So I'm going to select the SM cube and I'm going to go to UV editor. And the simplest thing that you should know is that the UVs that you have in here will transfer into any other package properly. However, I do want to mention that in most real-time settings, they do not use UDIMs. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but they don't use multiple UDIMs, meaning they keep most things for a single object in the 0 to 1 space. They may use what's called multiple material sets, which can kind of be done with UDIMs if you really know what you're doing. But the point is, most of the time you want to keep your assets, especially if they're not a hero asset like a character or a car or something really important like maybe a gun in a Call of Duty game or something, If they're not those and they're just background or environment assets that aren't a big deal, you usually want to keep everything into the 0 to 1 space and only use one texture set with that. You don't want to have metal here and wood here and leather here, and which is very common in film. Like that is something you would normally do in film, and you can do that. You're just going to be doing extra work and it's not going to run as well in Unreal because you're asking it to do more processing by having multiple texture sets and multiple things like that. Now, in case you do not understand, that does not mean that your stuff has to necessarily be lower resolution. If I have 4 UDIMs, 4 of these squares being utilized by 2K textures each, so a 2K texture, a 2K texture, a 2K texture, a 2K texture, that is the same texel resolution as saying 1 square with a 4K texture. Now, you don't usually want to go beyond 4K, and even 4K is pushing it, but it is getting more and more common. But the point being, there's a lot of play there. So there's a lot you can do, and this is something that you would want to practice on your own and look up more tutorials about. Just keep in mind, keep it as simple as possible while you're learning, and keep your UVs in the 0 to 1 space for your first attempts, especially because a lot of other packages, even Substance Painter, while it can do UV tiles and UDIMs, it definitely does become a lot more complex. Now that we talked about UVs, let's talk about materials. So we've already seen that in Unreal, it's been creating a material for us, and all of these are using the standard surface 1 in Maya, so it just created one. But the thing about material transfer is that very often you don't want it to do that. I'm just going to be entirely honest. You don't. In a production setting, there's going to be somebody that is assigned to doing surfacing within the final rendering package, which means if that is Unreal, they're going to mess with this material a lot. And there's no guarantee they're going to sit there and wait for you to create a material, and there's no guarantee that they're going to name it the same as what you named it. So very often they're just going to override what material is on your mesh anyways. If you double left click on any mesh in Unreal, it opens up the mesh window and the material slots are here. They're just going to override it. But what is important for us to know is how we can handle that, how we can deal with multiple materials, how we can name them and stuff like that, so you understand what might work well for your pipeline. So the first thing is, in any software package that handles FBX exporting correctly, if you name your materials within this package and export them out, those names will transfer. So if I go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, and I create a new Lambert, and I call this Lambert, I'm going to right click and hold on it and hit rename. I'm going to call it M underscore test material 01. So let's say I call that test material 01 and apply it to my cube. This is the cube smooth. But now when I export this to Unreal, it will transfer a material named that and create one. So let's go ahead and try that. Control-Alt-Shift-D, F, File, Game Exporter. Not going to change anything on here. I'm also not going to smooth it. I'm not going to worry about that, but I am going to export it over Cube Smooth. And then in Unreal, we are going to right-click and re-import. Now, I'm glad it's doing this because this shows you how important it is to get your stuff early on correct. What it's saying is, hey, this original version had a material called Standard Surface 1. You just re-imported it, and now it's using a material called M Test Material 01. These are unmatched. And it's asking us what we want to do. Well, the only options we have are done or reset to FBX. And if you hover over reset to FBX, it says change the material array to reflect the incoming FBX, match the ones that fit, keep the material instance from the existing data. Meaning it's not going to delete this material, but if I hit this, what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, I'm going to try and match what's already in here to whatever the new name of the slot was. Now, the new name of the slot was whatever I named it in Maya, right? I think it was material test 01, right? Something like that. And you notice it didn't create it. And that's because it's going to start getting confused if you change material names. It doesn't fully know what to do in that case. Now, if I had had a material named exactly what it was in Maya, it would have immediately applied it here. Now, I want you to keep in mind, it's not necessarily a good idea to sit here and delete this mesh and then re-import it to get everything again. Because what's going to happen if you do that is if you had that mesh in your scene, it's going to be removed and you're going to have to replace it. So getting these things correct early on is key. But remember that even if you don't, you're almost always going to be creating your own custom materials and reassigning them to the meshes anyways. That is proper etiquette. So it's okay. But let's look at another use case, because a really common thing within materials is that you usually will have two if your mesh is doing something like it's going to have some sections that are transparent and some that are opaque. Most of the time, you only want one material because every material slot you have on a mesh is going to equal one more render pass. So if I have 4 materials on this cube in Unreal, every frame it's being rendered 4 times. So you want to keep it to 1 as much as you can, but in cases where you need multiples, which does exist, you can do that. So we're going to create a new Lambert. I'm going to right click and hold on it, go to rename, and I'm going to call it m_test material 2. And I'm going to change it to red just so that we know it's different. I'm going to grab the top face of this cube, and then I will hold on the middle mouse button on this material and drag to that face and release. Now that I've done that, this object has 2 materials and it'll import into Unreal as 2 material slots. Control-Alt-Shift-D and F to delete history and freeze transformations. I still have the game exporter open, so I'm going to export, replace, go back into Unreal, right-click on it, re-import, and now it's telling me, hey, this one is still what the old one was, but you have a new one that's unmatched. I'll click that, and you'll notice if I go in here, it doesn't even know what to put here because it's only going to create those materials on the first import. But I can very easily create any material I want. And apply it to that mesh. So if I come in here, there are multiple ways I can do it. I can open up the content here and I can drag that material, or you could drop down and choose it. But now I've assigned that material to the top. So these are called material slots, and they're created and transferred in by making sure that you have multiple materials on the meshes that you're importing. Again, you usually only want one, and you should know that a lot of times while importing initially, you're usually going to want your stuff named well, but almost always you're going to run into an issue where it doesn't fully match and you're going to have to replace it anyways. This is common. I cannot stress enough how common it is that you just need to create your own materials. So the last thing I want to mention about this is that if I go ahead and delete this, which I will force delete, and I right click and import to game, and I choose Cube Smooth. If you scroll down, there is a section for material, and you can choose all sorts of different options. Normally, a lot of places that I've worked, what they'll do is they'll set the search location to just not even search and do not even create a material. When you do this and import it, it's going to still bring in the material slots, but it's not going to create materials. You'll just create them yourself. Very few people tell it to import the textures also. That's very uncommon. Normally, you want to do that manually because you want all the control you can get. However, do know what search location does is you're basically telling it where do you want it to search for a material that is named the same, and you have different options. And the material import method, you can say create new materials or create instant materials or do not create materials. Again, I usually leave it this way so that everything is clean and I can set it up my own self. So I'm going to hit import, and you can see it brought it in. There's no special materials that it made. If I double left click on it, there's still 2 slots that I can use though. Okay, the very final section of this video is going to talk about once you know all of this and you're creating a scene and you have multiple meshes in that scene, how do you deal with that with the game exporter? So let's very simply create 3 different cubes, and we will leave them as cube 1 and cube 2. That's totally fine. To make sure that we understand that they're different, we're going to scale them differently, and it doesn't matter how you scale them, you just want them to look different. And then we're going to grab everything in the scene and hit Control-Shift-D, Control-Shift-F. We just deleted all history, froze all transformations. Now remember, you would want to make sure all the other stuff we covered in this video is done. Your materials, your UVs, your normals, your pivots, your sizes and scales. You want to name everything correctly, and this is super important for what we're about to do, the naming. Because now that we have these, I can grab them all, make sure we're still on export selection, but we're going to change settings from export to single file to export to multiple files. Now, the tricky thing here is that once you do that, you don't realize that this file name has just changed to what's called a multi-file prefix, right? I don't even want a prefix, because what it's going to do is name these what their object names are, right? So if I have all of these and I'm exporting them separately, then I would go ahead and no prefix, because I've named them exactly how I want, set it to the folder, and then hit export. Now it's going to ask me, hey, do you want to replace these files because they already exist? And I do. Now I still have them set to move to origin, so everything should be good. Let's go into Unreal. And what we can do is we can right click and import. And you can see in our folder, we now have cube 1, cube 2. Let's go ahead and grab them all, hit open. And it says, hey, there's some that already exist. Do you want to overwrite? I'll hit apply to all. Yes. And then the new ones, it's going to come up and say, hey, you have options. I'm going to hit import all. And there they are. So we have cube smoothed. We have this cube that I scaled awkwardly, right? So we have that. It's in there. That's pivot is correct. We have cube 2 right there. And we have the SM cube, right? So everything is still here that we had, and all the new stuff is here, and it did all the pivots. It moved it to the origins correctly and everything. Now, you might say this is all good, but there is one last thing about exporting multiple objects that you need to know, and it can even account for other objects. And that's called combining meshes. So one of the things that is common if you're actually modeling something is it's not going to be necessarily one contiguous mesh. It's going to be multiple meshes plunged together, put together, and it creates some sort of object, right? And you want them all as one object that you can manipulate. Like, for example, if I took these cubes and plunged them together, and I was like, this is the modeled object. This is what I want in my scene. In Maya, you can do things like group. It's going to change the pivot, and you're going to have to deal with that. But the truth is, the best way to handle this is to just know what's going to happen and choose what you like the most. If you group it and you set the pivot correctly, if you select this group, this thing is smart enough that if you export it, it will output an FBX of this group. However, if I do that, and let's go ahead and do that, hit yes. It was asking if I wanted to replace, because again, I have tested this. We'll go ahead and import, and you see it's group 1 FBX because that's what it was named. I'm just going to not change anything and hit import to show you what will happen. It just created 3 separate meshes called group 1 SM cube blah 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 blah, right? Each one is here, they're not together. That's not what we wanted. So let's go ahead and right click and import again, and you'll notice under the top, if I hit mesh and then go to advanced, there is a checkbox called Combine Meshes. So now if I have combined meshes on and hit import, it will do that properly. Now, the pivot is still in the wrong location, so you would want to get the pivot to the right location. And honestly, this is a good method. If you name your groups well and make sure that you don't accidentally individually select these objects, instead you're just selecting the group when you export, and you have the pivot correct, this will work as long as you have combined meshes on. You still definitely need to make sure you have export multiple files on, because if you don't, and let's say I grabbed all of these, the combined meshes option in Unreal would bring them all in as one piece that I would move around, not separate pieces that I could manipulate. And the other option in Maya, which is destructive, but you can do it, is if you go to Mesh Combine, it will literally combine them to one object. And obviously, that is definitely going to work. The problem is, this can be destructive depending on how you're modeling. This could work or it might not work for your pipeline. Anything is possible with enough work, but what works well for the object you're creating? So again, what I would recommend is probably use groups because it's non-destructive, and then just name them well and get your pivots correct. And you can move group pivots the same way you move any other type of pivot. Then just when you export, make sure that you don't select these sub-objects in the group if you're exporting them all out. Now that covers pretty much everything, and I hope this was very informative. These type of things are vitally important within the industry that you get correct early on, and it can save you a lot of time if you're doing things in the proper fashion. If you have any questions, I encourage you to comment and ask. Good luck.